Welcome everybody to another episode of Green Talks. I'm Ryan Thogmartin. That is Darren Crouch with Passages International. And Darren, we have a basic topic today, but it's insanely important. You and I have talked a lot about this off camera, and it's really a topic of what is a green funeral. And there's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of people that think they know what a green funeral is, but we're not really defined, I think, in the profession and absolutely on the consumer level of understanding fully what a green funeral is. So that's what we're going to break down today. So let's start with the basic question of what does a green funeral look like and entail?
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me again, Ryan. I think before I answer that question, I just want to kind of point something out, which is, we're 5 or 6 conversations into this topic of green talks, and we're talking now about green burial. And I think that really speaks to the breadth of what green is in the funeral business. And I think it's really important that we remember that, and maybe we can come back to that later in the conversation. But, a green funeral, I guess, in its purest form, green burial, would typically be, the burial of an unembalmed body in an eco-friendly container, either like wicker, pine, simple pine, cloth shroud, usually a hand-dug grave, very limited mechanized equipment like mowers and diggers, no fertilizer at the cemetery, no headstone, no concrete vault, as low impact on the environment as possible. So I would say in its purest form, that's a green burial. Even though that's a green burial, you're still going to have an impact from that. The only way to have a purely green funeral is if somebody walks out into the woods, drops dead, and we leave them there, right?
Yeah.
But if we have to make a removal, refrigerate the body, transport the body to the cemetery, there's going to be an impact. And I think that's what's really important to remember is, we want to make it as green as possible. However, we need to pay attention to what the consumer wants. So, some consumers, for example, it may be the grandma that just died, but the grandpa died 10 years ago, and he's buried at the traditional cemetery, and they have 2 plots. Now, the cemetery might require a vault in that traditional part of the cemetery, but the family may want a wicker casket, for example, or they may choose not to embalm the body. So there are ways to green the funeral without having to have the darkest shade of green.
Sure.
And I think that's what's really important, is to listen to the consumer and find out exactly what they want. For example, we literally had a family. We're in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We had a family last week drive from San Antonio, Texas, to pick up a casket from us. They drove overnight on a Thursday. They arrived on Friday morning, and they drove back Friday to have a funeral on Saturday. And that speaks to how important it is for some families to have this type of product. But it also speaks to, well, is that green? They drove 28 hours round trip to get a wicker casket. Now, how much gas did they burn in their Suburban or whatever they came in to get that product? So, we as a company at Passages, we don't want to judge people if they just want to dip their toe in the water, and if that just means, a biodegradable urn after cremation, or if they want to go whole hog green burial. We got the full gamut of products to help families or funeral directors cater to that family. And we're not going to judge anywhere on that spectrum.
I like it. So, I mean, it's safe to say that green is trying to minimize the environmental impact. You're not going to totally negate all of it, and each family kind of has their own barometer of what they're comfortable with. So in that case, then what is the environmental impact of a traditional funeral?
Well, I mean, if we look at some of the data, and some of this data might be a little bit older, and we're looking at, 30 million board feet of timber that goes into wood caskets, 90,000 tons of steel, 1.6 million tons of concrete in vaults, 800,000 gallons of embalming fluid. I mean, that's enough, I think, to fill, I think they use the analogy of filling 8 Olympic-sized swimming pools with formaldehyde-based embalming fluid. So it has an environmental impact. In America, we're lucky because it's a huge country. You look at other countries like the UK where it's much, much smaller, and green burial is almost a necessity because they're running out of land. Um, we don't talk about the land very much, and we don't here in the US because we have lots of land. But in other countries, I mean, land is a premium, and they can't just be, can't have these sprawling cemeteries everywhere. And so
Right.
green burial allows them to take land that might be a woodland or a parkland area and actually have burials of bodies or cremated remains there, and you wouldn't even know it's a cemetery. So you could
Sure.
be walking in the woods, and it just feels like you're walking on a trail. And so I think, there's that environmental impact there, but there's also that really cool feeling of, being in a place that's part of nature still.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And I remember being in Amsterdam consulting with a funeral home, and they have like 10-year graves where everything has to be biodegradable because they reuse the land is limited. They reuse that land over and over and over again for multiple families. So, all right, we touched on a little bit like that we can kind of customize what green looks like for each family. I want to hit on the arrangement though. We've done some other videos where your company's making that arrangement process a lot easier for the funeral home and doing things that are experience based. So how can the arrangement be green?
So, I'm not sure that the arrangement itself can be green. I think you still need to go through all the processes. I mean, if you're sitting making arrangements with families, you're going to ask whether or not they want embalming or not, if they just
Hmm.
want washing or preparation of the body without embalming. Um, in terms of shrouding the body, selecting a product that's more eco-friendly, having those products available for families so you don't have to put them on an airplane. This is the third day in a row that we have put a wicker casket on a Southwest Airlines flight.
Wow.
$700, and it tells you the extent that people will go to, and it also talks about, well, how green is that? Um,
Yeah.
but I think, if you're not offering it in the selection room and in the arrangement process, you're missing a huge opportunity, because I think data shows, I think in 2017, they did a survey and it was like 54% of families are interested in green. And as we talked about earlier in the conversation, that may not all be the darkest shade of green,
Yeah.
but that needs to be part of the conversation. Families are experiencing and making green decisions in every other part of their lives. It only makes sense that when they come to a funeral home and they sit down and they make arrangements, that is at least brought up in the conversation, so that families have the opportunity um, to consider it. I think,
Hmm.
one of the things that when I talk to families or funeral directors that have helped a family do a green burial, they talk about how powerful it was and how meaningful it was. And I think if a funeral director did a green funeral and saw the power of that experience for that family, they would be much more inclined to do it. And I feel like funeral directors are nervous. It's not in their wheelhouse. It's not something they do on a regular basis. And so they have to get
Yeah.
that familiarity with it. um, and when they have that, then they're going to be much more comfortable presenting it. I think the other thing too is I think families also realize that this is relatively new, and they don't expect it to be perfect. You know,
That's right.
they expect you to be open to it and be willing to help them through this process. And if everyone is learning at the same time, it's not the end of the world. I think the beauty of the funeral director is they've dealt with many deceased bodies. And if something
Hmm.
goes slightly wrong, they're there as a guide to the family to help them resolve those issues. And there's value in that. And I think families would much rather pay for that assurance and that expertise than pay $4,000 or $5,000 for a metal casket. And so that's where I think the dilemma for funeral directors comes in, is they're scratching their heads going, well, if I'm not selling a $6,000 or $7,000 metal casket or cherry casket, where am I going to make my money? Well, you're going to
Hmm.
make your money as being as guiding families through this process, so that as the body starts to purge or some other crazy thing goes on, they're there to hold their hands and guide them through it.
Well, you said something there that as we wrap up, I want to touch on. You said that a funeral home or funeral director in that arrangement process they need to give the option of green to the family. You and I both know that funeral directors can get in a routine and arrangement process. They go through, they say the same things, they show the same collateral. Like it gets so routine that breaking that routine just completely throws them for a loop. I'll never forget rearranging a slat wall in a funeral home, one of the first sales calls I ever made, and a funeral director called me ripping me because I removed something from it. I said, I didn't remove it, I just moved it. And like, they get so routine. So to that point, what do funeral directors need to know about green funerals? Just the bare minimum. What do they need to know about green funerals?
I think they need to know there's lots of products out in the market. There's lots of interest for it. They need to know that it can be very profitable and it's not a threat, it's an opportunity. And I think most families, when you present it to them, are much more open to it than they may think. I mean, what I hear from funeral directors a lot is nobody's asking for it. Well, no one's asking for it because most people don't know about it. It's only the people that really go out of their way to research it that find what they want. And once you've done the burial or the cremation, if they weren't able to incorporate those aspects they see value in, then you end up with a consumer who's not fully satisfied. So
yeah, which is where we're at. I mean, consumers aren't satisfied most of the time with what they get.
Right. Right. And I think the other thing too is not one size fits all. I mean, if a family, like I said, wants to forego embalming, but they want to be buried in a vault, have a vault, and it's not the end of the world. It's at least it's a step greener than it was the traditional way.
Sure. I love it. Well, Darren, again, thanks for coming on and being a part of these. I think this is an important conversation because, we have a consumer, like you said, 54% are interested. Over half of the population that's dying is interested in green burials, but it's just a conversation that isn't had, and it needs to be. So kudos to you and your team that are doing, a lot of very interesting things and valuable things to assist funeral homes in this process and get them educated as well. So if funeral homes want to connect with you, they can go to passagesinternational.com, as well as finding you on all the major social media platforms: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter. You're there, you're active, and you're putting out a lot of resourceful content that's going to help them have better conversations with the families that they're serving around the topic of green funerals. So Darren, thank you so much. And we'll look forward to the next episode.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate it.